Welcome to today's upload. Today we're going to look at Act 1 of Inspector Calls. We're going to look at the plot, storyline, the characters, and we're going to use some quotes to talk our way through the act. So the first thing we need to know in Inspector Calls is the setting. Where is it set? It's set in 1912 England. It's Edwardian England. We're at a dinner party in the Birling's household, and Sheila Birling has become engaged to Gerald, and the family are having a celebration. During the celebration there's an interruption. An inspector arrives wanting to interview the family regarding the death of a young lady called Eva Smith. So the characters in Inspector Calls: the Birling family. We have Sheila Birling, who's the daughter, Mr. Birling, Mrs. Birling, and Eric, the son. Now the Birlings represent money, wealth, capitalism. They come across as selfish and ignorant. They represent the capitalism, the status, that it's all about where you are in society, your standing and your financial positioning. Other characters are Gerald. Now Gerald, we learn, is getting engaged to Sheila. Mr. Birling, one quote he mentions: Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing but working together. So the engagement brings a financial and a business wealth to Mr. Birling. Sheila, she receives the ring. I think it's perfect. Now I am really engaged. So this symbol of marriage, the ring, she receives it from Gerald. Gerald also represents the business, the working, the above working class, the middle class man. He represents wealth, capitalism. He's selfish and he has a high status. Throughout the play, he seems to be the one that agrees with Mr. Birling on many of Mr. Birling's points and opinions, where others argue and disagree. We also have the inspector. Now Priestley uses the inspector to represent truth, responsibility, socialism. Priestley uses him as an instrument to put his message across to the audience. It's arguable that he's supernatural. His name's Inspector Girl. Is he a real person? Is he a ghost? There is that question throughout the play. He's omniscient. Now omniscient means he's godlike, he's all-knowing. He seems to be one step ahead of everyone. He knows he knows everything that has happened before it's asked, so he's almost guiding the characters in the confessions. Now a summary of Act 1. It's a dinner party. We're introduced to the Birling's world. It is the play. It takes place in the Birling's house, in the Birling's dining room, and it is like a bubble. The bubble of capitalism, you could call it. We have Birling's long-winded and conceited views. It's Mr. Birling. In Act 1 he starts with several speeches, and we learn that he's very conceited. He likes the sound of his own voice. And then the inspector arrives, and we learn about Eva Smith, a young girl who has committed suicide. Now at first Mr. Birling blames Eva's attitude and behaviour for his sacking of her. We find out that Eva worked for Mr. Birling, and he sacked her. Eva then went to work in Millwood's store, and Sheila, the daughter, admits jealousy in requesting the department store manager at Millwood's to sack Eva. We also find out that Gerald recognises when Eva changed her name to Daisy Renton, and he asks Sheila to keep it from the detective. Gerald and Sheila have a quiet discussion, and Gerald admits that having an affair with Daisy, but he tries to pressure Sheila into not saying anything. Throughout Act 1, Sheila and Eric show sympathy, which contrasts to Gerald and Mr. Birling. Gerald and Mr. Birling display a lack of morals. The affair that Gerald had, the secrets and the want to keep secrets from the inspector, and a lack of respect for the workers and the working class people. So that is a summary. Let's look at some of the quotes. So Mr. Birling immediately establishes wealth. He says, giving us poor Edna at the very start of the play. So they have a maid, Edna, and they are drinking port. It is a wealthy family. Sheila below is asked a question, and she states, yes, go on, mummy. So Sheila's a grown adult, she's getting engaged, and she's calling her mother mummy. So what does that imply? What does that tell us? Well, to me it tells us that she's very immature. She's spoiled. Remember that analogy of a bubble, that in the house of this capitalism, this wealthy bubble, they don't have a clue what's going on in the outside world. They're far from reality. So Sheila is very immature. Mrs. Birling, when talking to Sheila, you'll have to get used to that just as I had. And Sheila says, I don't believe I will. That is when they're talking about Gerald had claims to have gone away on business and wasn't at home very much part of earlier in the year. So straight away we see Sheila, although she's very immature, she's got a bit of strength. I don't believe I will. She's standing up saying, I won't accept this, I won't get used to this. So from the very start, the younger generation, Sheila, we find out that there may be a possibility of change. Now we come to Mr. Birling's speeches. Now very interesting when you look at the speeches and we analyse them. He says to Gerald, you're just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted. What kind of son-in-law did he always want? A rich man, part of a wealthy family, a business partner, a future possible business partner for Mr. Birling. So Mr. Birling he's implying he'd rather have a son-in-law that brings financial benefits and business benefits rather than happiness to his daughter. We also have a repetition of phrases. He says, I'm a hard-headed businessman. He says this 3 times in the first few pages. He says the German officers are talking nonsense. Don't want war. War is impossible. 3 times he mentions that there will not be a war. And then he says the Titanic is unsinkable, utterly unsinkable. Repetition of unsinkable. So what is Priestley telling us about Mr. Birling or about capitalism in his early speeches? He's obsessed in his status. People have to know he is a businessman. I'm a hard-headed businessman. He's saying it as if he wants to impress Gerald. And then when he mentions the war, again saying that 3 times, and the Titanic won't sink, it's unsinkable, we get this view that Mr. Birling is a very conceited, capitalistic man. He's obsessed in wealth and money, and we know that what he says, and the audience at the time would know what he says, is untrue. There was a war. War did happen, and the Titanic did sink. So Priestley is using Mr. Birling. He's a construct for Priestley to show that these business capitalistic men, they like the sound of their own voices, but they don't have a clue about reality. They're so far away from the norm, they don't know what they're talking about, and when they are talking, they are often very, very wrong. So Priestley straight away is emphasising Mr. Birling as this rich, wealthy man who likes the sound of his voice and doesn't really have a clue of what's going on in the politics of the real world. He also tells Miss Gerald he's on the honours list to be knighthooded. Again, he's trying to impress Gerald's status. And he mentions it's a token of self-respect. There's a token of self-respect, he says, which is quite a nice quote. And the reason I put this quote in, because later on in the act, when Eva's talking about Sheila's talking about Eva at Millwoods, Mr. Birling says nothing wrong about looking good. It's a token of your self-respect. So he mentions that emphasising how you look is important, not who you are. The inspector comes along, and on several occasions he says one person, one line of inquiry, especially when Gerald tries to push him along and asks to see the photograph. The inspector has a photo, and one by one he shows each person and asks them questions. And Gerald says, can we just all see the photograph? One person, one line of inquiry is the inspector's reply. Priestley uses the inspector. Now we've said he's his voice. The inspector brings a calm and control, quite the opposite of Mr. Birling. The inspector is calm and controlling. When the characters talk of Eva Smith in Act 1, Mr. Birling has found out she's committed suicide, and he recognises who she is, and he says the wretched girl. He calls her a wretched girl. The adjective wretched. He shows no remorse. However, Sheila, how horrible. Was it an accident? And then when they're discussing how Eva had asked for a pay rise, Eric states you can't blame her. Why shouldn't she try for higher wages? When talking of firing her, Sheila says it was a mean thing to do. It spoiled everything for her. So Sheila and Eric in Act 1, we are seeing the younger generation show emotions and show understanding. Gerald, who's also young, but he's part of the aristocracy, the richer than rich, he says to Mr. Birling, we'd have done the same thing. He agrees with Mr. Birling. Gerald and Mr. Birling, it shows the wealthy, the aristocracy, they will not change. Priestley has shown that we need to focus on the younger generation. The younger generation are capable of change, and the quotes on this page kind of reflect this. So, a summary of the quote. Inspector, he sums up a lot of young women. Sheila says they're people. So the inspector says this is not a one-off. This is the working class, the women, the younger women, the working class aren't being treated properly. He talks about everything as a whole, not just as an individual. And Sheila agrees they are people. When we're talking about Millwards, Sheila, the stage direction says miserably, so I'm responsible. Here Sheila is accepting responsibility for her actions. If they didn't get rid, close account with them. The inspector says, were you jealous of her? And she says, yes, I suppose so. Sheila, again, that change, that younger generation change, and it's there. She changed her name to Daisy Renton. Gerald, stage directing, startled. What? Look at the reactions. Sheila miserably. Gerald startled. And Gerald says, we can keep it from him when talking to Sheila, showing that Gerald, he wants to keep the secrets. He is showing that, and this is at the very end of Act 1, that he doesn't believe in telling the truth. Again, it's emphasising the rich and the wealthy and the selfishness of them. And this concludes Act 1 of An Inspector Calls.